Australia has a cost of living crisis. Unfortunately, both the federal and especially the state governments are making it worse. No doubt, for example, you've seen the prices go up every time you go to the supermarket, but the cost of everything has increased. The RBA has revealed that it expects wages to grow by significantly less than inflation over the next couple of years. People are going backwards. If you need to hire a tradie, that's going to cost you more than it did. And this is because the tradies' own expenses have increased significantly, and there's simply more demand for their work. Everything has gotten more expensive, and the state governments shoulder a lot of the blame. And this brings me to one of the problems: debt and deficit. This is a problem both for inflation right now, and therefore for the cost of living right now, but it's also a problem for government financial responsibility more broadly, because it tells us how the governments are acting, and it tells us the governments have simply failed to get their houses in order. Victoria is one of the worst offenders, and is probably worse than all of the other states, potentially worse than all of the other ones combined. The state government recently posted a $2.5 billion deficit between July and September, an absolutely massive number. Debt now stands at some $120 billion, which is significantly more than New South Wales, for example. The Victorian government will pay hundreds of million dollars in compensation in relation to the Commonwealth Games, and that's just one of the many areas of wasteful expenditure in the Victorian government. They're simply throwing money away. But the thing is the politicians throwing other people's money away. They can do this because they're not bearing the direct cost, or at least not bearing all of it. The total expenditure for the first quarter of this financial year comes to some $23 billion, up $1.8 billion from this time last year. Victoria is spending like a drunken sailor. And a big reason for this deficit, of course, is financing costs in relation to major building projects, and the Victorian government simply baking in a fiscal deficit. The more money they borrow, then the more interest they're going to have to pay, which means they're going to have an even greater budget deficit, which means more interest, in a vicious spiral. But the Victorian government doesn't have a good strategy to get this under control. Rather, their strategy seems to be either to borrow more money just to pay interest, and or to increase taxes, neither of which are good for Victoria's citizens. Victoria is not alone, of course. The Australian Financial Review reports that state governments in total will borrow some $160 billion over the next 4 years, taking the total debt load to $400 billion. States will hold almost 40% of the $1.1 trillion of national debt by 2026 to 2027. This is up from just 10% of the national debt from the year before the pandemic. An absolutely staggering increase in the amount of debt. It appears these state governments simply can't get their houses in order. Victoria's ALP government has responded, as the ALP normally would, by increasing taxes. The ALP has introduced myriad additional tax measures, seemingly aimed directly at either property owners or businesses, oftentimes both. For example, there's a temporary payroll tax surcharge, which may not actually be temporary because oftentimes these things are extended into the future. And this is 0.5%. That's actually quite a sizable amount, because a payroll tax applies when you go out and hire an employee. If you're imposing the 0.5% payroll tax on companies, then that's clearly another cost they're going to bear. And companies, where possible, are going to try to pass this on to consumers because otherwise they end up wearing it and end up going backwards. This therefore exacerbates inflation. You've also got the myriad land tax surcharges, which have gone out across multiple different areas. For example, an additional 0.1 percentage points on properties where the land is valued at over $300,000. And as state governments often do, they keep revaluing land upwards and upwards and upwards over time, so they can bring more people into their measures. And those revaluations oftentimes have nothing to do whatsoever with how much you could actually sell the property for. And then there's the absentee land tax of between 2 and 4%. Again, a phenomenal amount of money. And oftentimes those properties that are vacant are in holiday locations, often not in locations where there's a rental shortage. Rather, they're applying more broadly. And these are just a couple of the other ways that the Victorian government is trying to raise revenue. New South Wales has undertaken some slightly less significant measures, but nevertheless are still trying to raise some revenue, playing around with, for example, things to do with trusts, playing around with percentage ownerships and how that relates to land tax. The Victorian government stands alone in how significantly bad and draconian its measures have been, and how little responsibility the Victorian government actually wants to take for all of the debt and deficit they're accruing. Now, the debt and deficit obviously have major problems. Firstly, you've got the direct problem, you need to pay for it, which seemingly is manifesting in higher taxes for Victorians. The second issue is it exacerbates inflation. And the reason it exacerbates inflation is, like I said, many of the things like the payroll tax surcharge will be passed on to, in this case, on to customers. In relation to the land taxes, they could be passed on either to renters in some cases, although rents are often set by the market, but also more pointedly, it's passed on in a stymieing of property development. After all, who is going to go out and build property developments if they're going to be hit by this large tax? It reduces the incentive to go out and invest in these property developments. And the reason that is important is, say you build an apartment block. Some of those apartments will sell to owner-occupiers, some of them will sell to investors. The property developer needs both parties to participate for them to get the property off the ground, because they need to be able to sell enough units for the property development to actually be viable. But when the state government goes around and makes the property developments less viable, you get less construction. In essence, the Victorian government is bringing in moves that actually deter additional supply coming to the market, and therefore deter things such as rental crises being sorted out. The Victorian government, and other state governments to some extent, are making things worse. Then you've got the issue in terms of interest rates. Now, the Victorian government is going around borrowing more money. Now, this creates a problem because it creates more demand for debt. That is, there are more people, more borrowers who are wanting to borrow more money, in this case, the state government trying to do so. This then is going to push up the required rate of return that a lender requires for them to actually lend money. Or put differently, in a supply and demand type market, if there's more demand for debt, then the cost of that debt is going to go up, which will ultimately feed into the cost of debt for everyone else. The state government is effectively taking credit out of the market. Then you've added on to this the fact that the state government is using this money to go around and spend willy-nilly on random things. Some of these might be productive. Some infrastructure spending might still be worthwhile doing because it might lead to productive economic growth. Or phrased differently, the upside you get from that infrastructure might more than offset its costs, including the costs of the interest. However, at the moment, when they're going around building infrastructure, it adds to supply shortages of things like labor and materials, which then adds to construction costs, which then makes it less viable to go and build a new property, and it makes it more expensive for a landlord to maintain an existing property, thereby forcing them to raise the rents just to break even due to the higher increase in costs. Furthermore, it exacerbates the labor shortage. Now, to some extent, that's a good problem to have. Everyone having a job is a good thing. However, when the government is going around increasing the demand for labor, it will then increase the wages associated with some of those jobs. For the people in question, that's good. However, for the people who then need to pay for them, so private sector people, people needing a handyman or a tradesman or an electrician, and then makes things more expensive, exacerbating inflation. So you end up with this price pressure on both services and on goods, due to the state government's expenditure. The state government is spending more, thereby forcing prices up, and then when this occurs, they're taxing people more, which thereby reduces their disposable income by even more. The state governments are making everything worse. Victoria is perhaps the most egregious example. However, other state governments have done this to varying extents. It doesn't appear that the state governments are getting their houses in order at all. Part of the reason for this is the state governments appear to be quite entrenched. Whenever a state government comes into power, it oftentimes stays in power for quite a while. We've seen this in Victoria with Dan Andrews and his successor. We've seen this in New South Wales, where the Liberal government held power for quite some time, until it was turfed up by the Labor government, which oftentimes is likely to remain in power for a while, because that's often the case with state governments. In part, this is because the opposition party is simply below the radar. No one sees the opposition party in a state government. They're simply not in the news coverage. As a result, many of these politicians simply stay in power for an extended time until everything goes catastrophically wrong. And that could easily be the case in New South Wales, still in Victoria, potentially in Queensland, although Anastasia Palaszczuk is struggling. State governments oftentimes end up being entrenched. And when they're entrenched, you lack the outside disciplinary mechanisms to remove them and to discipline them to force them to perform well. For example, we see people like Anastasia Palaszczuk become entrenched and difficult, if not impossible, to remove. It creates a major problem for voters. It creates one of those issues where, while in an ideal world, having localized power bases, so councils or state governments, is good in terms of decentralizing power, The problem is who ultimately ends up getting that power when it is decentralized. Because you end up with a clown show that is local councils, which are clearly manifestly incompetent and don't represent their constituents, through to state governments, which are sometimes barely more passable, but again, just do what Victoria is doing. The only saving grace is sometimes some of these measures, like Victoria's EV tax, are challenged in the High Court and are thrown out. But when that tax is thrown out, it just means the tax base for Victoria becomes narrower and they hit everyone else even more. In essence, these state governments, and to an extent the federal government, are making everyone's lives more miserable. And we can just hope that next election, all of these high-spending, high-taxing state governments are turfed out. But do let me know your thoughts about the Victorian state government or any of the other ones in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear whether you think they have any saving graces here. Otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you next time as well.